I'm Rico. Rico Tice. I'm not called Tico Rice, but some of the called Tico Rice. It sounds like I'm Rico Tice. Tico Rice, that sounds like number 42 at the takeaway anyway. It's Rico Tice. But I'm going to interview this chap here, Richard Ledbetter. And the reason I'm interviewing him is that he played professional football. So who did you play for, Rich?
I was at Wolverhampton Wanderers, who are now a lot more successful than when I played for them. Hereford United, and then Stevenage Borough.
So tell us about playing for the first team at Wolves. How many times did you play for them?
12 minutes. I played for 12 minutes.
But that gets you listed as a Premier League player, does it?
It does. Do you know, I discovered I'm a record breaker recently, and that is I'm the cheapest, most expensive signing in the Football League. That is, you know how every team has a most expensive signing. So Man United is Pogba, 89 million. I am Stevenage's record signing, which was 20,000, but that is the cheapest, most expensive signing in the Football League. So imagine, a Manchester United fan and a Stevenage fan are chatting, and they say, "What's your most expensive signing in history?" And he says, "Pogba, 89 million." Stevenage fan, "Who's your most expensive signing in history?" Richard Ledbetter, 20,000. So, yeah.
And tell me, the money that you earned playing pro football, how did you spend it? You spent it.
I didn't. I barely earned enough to spend anything.
But didn't you go to theological college with it?
Not quite, but I did have a drastic career change of playing football to being a vicar. So the natural sort of career progression.
And actually, funny enough, when you were playing professional football, age 15, 16, just tell us about coming to faith then, and what was it?
So I didn't grow up in a Christian home, so I had no idea about Christianity until my sister became a Christian. My basic thought was that Christians are weird, because all the Christians I'd ever seen were weird, but my sister wasn't weird, so I couldn't work out how you could be a Christian and not weird. So I started going to church to find out about that. At around the time I started playing professional football. So I think initially thought Christianity is true, I want this, but had no idea anything about it. But then being involved in the professional football world, not everyone is a Christian. In fact, nobody's a Christian, so it's very tough. So for several years, I sort of struggled thinking, I think Christianity is true, but everything around me was going in a very different direction. So that was hard initially.
But then, didn't people at the club help you get down through it?
Oh, that's true, yeah. So there was a first team player at Wolves called Brian Law, who was a Welsh international, very good player. He was about 6'5", and built like an outside toilet, and he came up to me one day and said, in the gym, I was very weak, very small, very thin, and he said to me, "Leddy, you're a Christian, aren't you?" And I was so scared by this man, I said yes. I'd never told anyone I was a Christian. But if he'd have said, "Leddy, you're a Muslim, aren't you?" I'd have said yes, because I was so terrified by this man. So that was a real help, because he was popular, he was more famous, he was a strong character. So that gave me the courage to sort of come out a little bit more and identify as a Christian.
And then he ran a Bible study?
He did. There was a Bible study for professional players in the Midlands area where I was from, and started going along, and that helped enormously. Looking at the Bible and the person of Jesus, but also alongside people who were facing the same kind of things that I was facing.
Two last questions, Eddie. Question one, where's the church locally and when does it meet?
So we're called King's Church. Pastor of a church now called King's. We meet at Boxgrove Primary School at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoons.
Second league prediction tomorrow for Saturday?
I think England will win 2-0. I'm confident. I think we're all away. It's coming home. It's definitely coming home.
Now look, the trouble is, Eddie, I've got a seat now. Now they're not going to believe you, because they can't trust that. We're never going to beat Suarez. We're not going to beat Uruguay.
There's a difference with this England team, I think. There's hope.
Anyway, there we go. I don't believe that last bit. Anyway, thank you, Leddy, for all but the last bit. Right, how are we doing? Yeah. Like Leddy, I didn't come from a Christian home either, so I had a number of views of Christianity as I grew up. The first was that it was boring. So my mum took us along to church now and again, and I used to sit in church and count the bricks up the wall. I just thought, this is just for the birds. Second thing is, I not just don't think it was boring, I don't think it was relevant. So we used to have the Bible when I was at school. Once a week we'd have scripture lessons. And I couldn't see what relevance this book, written 2,000 years ago, 2,000 miles away, had to me. So to make it relevant, I used to lead through it and look for references to rugby. And I found a number between the ages of 9 and 13 I was pleased with. One to referees in John 9 verse 1. I knew a man blind from birth, well, that was quite good. One to foul play in Acts 13 verse 3. So Paul and Barnabas were sent off. I was quite pleased with that. And my favourite one was to crash tackling in Acts 20 verse 24. It's better to give than receive. But that was basically the result of four years of scripture. I just didn't think it was relevant. The next problem I had with it as a teenager was I just didn't think it was true. So in my mind, I had a picture of Jesus as a sort of long-haired hippie in a nightie, floating around the Holy Land. So it's blasphemous to say that, but I mean, that's how I saw him. And Jesus walking on the water, the three kings, Winnie the Pooh and the Great Limpopo River, were all wrapped up together. So at school we used to sing, and did those feet in ancient times walk up on England's path to green? No, they didn't as far as I could work out. He never came to England. So I just didn't think it was true. So that's where I was. It was boring, it was irrelevant, it was untrue. And the next problem I had was clergy. Can't believe I am one now. But so I got ordained and became a vicar, mainly because I got a third at university. When I got my third, I said to my tutor, was I close to a 2-2? He said, no, Rico, it was a solid third. So I knew then that ordination to the Church of England was the only career option available, so I got ordained. But frankly, I just thought the clergy were just so wet. And I spent my time in rugby circles trying not to be wet. So I spent my time doing things like this. And I didn't know any clergy that could do that. Have you come across these? These are crushable cans. So I've got the most beaten up car in central London. It's a Ford Fiesta 1.1. I drive through the middle of London. I stop at the lights. Someone comes up alongside in a Porsche with someone very glamorous next to them. I look across at them, crush this on my head, and as we drive off, I've won. So this saves me about 100,000 quid, this does, as I go off. Now, can I just say, it's easy to deceive people. And there I was, as a teenager, thinking the Christian faith was boring, irrelevant, and untrue. And now I can't think of greater privilege than speaking to you about the person of Christ. What caused that change? How was my thinking wrong? Well, the person who really changed me was my godfather. I don't know if you've got godparents, but I guess that's what they're meant to do. But he did it in a pretty weird way. On the 6th of August, 1982, he was killed in a cliff fall. So he was sailing at a small island. He lived in Canada. He moored his yacht. He went for a walk. There was a tree that had fallen across the cliff path. He tried to climb over the tree. He slipped. He fell off the cliff, and he was killed. And when the news of that came through, that was the first time I'd ever seen my dad cry. So my dad was his younger brother. He'd been to the Olympics, this godfather, made a lot of money in shipping. I sort of worshipped the ground he stood on. He had 4 daughters, no son. I felt like a son to him. And suddenly he's dead. Now, this was the issue. Nobody in my family had ever spoken to me about death. It was a totally taboo subject. We just never discussed it. And suddenly my godfather's dead, and no one has an answer to it. I've buried 9 of my school friends. So 9 guys I was at school with, I've buried. And you know, you stand at the graveside of a schoolmate, and you look down on his coffin, this bloke you've been at school with, and you say these words from Psalm 103 as a vicar. As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field, but the wind blows in its place and remembers it no more. In other words, we do flourish, but it's over so quickly. And when my godfather was killed, I knew that I didn't have a solution to death. I remember thinking, what is the answer to this? He's dead, and what do we do about that? This is the funeral card of my best mate from university. We were at Bristol together. We played rugby at Twickenham in '87 together. He was captain, I was vice captain. He was a wonderful chap, and he died of a pulmonary embolism 10 years ago, and I took his funeral, and his kids were standing at the back of his coffin. I mean, what do you do with that? So that was the first issue. My godfather was killed. The second issue was I couldn't work out what life was about in the light of his death. And then, I don't know why it was, but there I was 15, 16, having this bit of a crisis. And my godmother had given me a Bible, and somehow I started reading this passage. I wonder if you can see it here, the one you've got in front of you. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 2, so it's King Solomon. And he's a man with the wealth, money, gifts, and time to find meaning in life wherever he thinks it might be found. And he sits down and he says, do you see verse 3 there in that first passage? The last 2 lines of the first paragraph. He said, I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. So life is so short. I knew that because my godfather was dead. What is the point? What are we meant to be doing? And so that's where I was really. And here is King Solomon, and he says, okay, what's life about? It's a pleasure-based life. Life's about pleasure. And do you see the start? Can you have a look down, guys? Verse 1, I thought in my heart, come now, I'll test you with pleasure to find out what's good. But that proved to be meaningless. Laughter is foolish, I said, and what does pleasure accomplish? So he says, okay, I'll tell you what life's about. Life's about having a laugh with your mates. Just make sure you have a laugh. But actually, he says, you could be having a laugh with your mates and still so lonely inside. In Proverbs, one of the books he writes, he says, even in laughter the heart may ache. So I've been involved with the suicides of 5 men since Christmas. 5 people who've killed themselves. And with one of them, 48 hours before, he was the heart and soul of the party. He was 14 years old. And people just could not understand what he'd done. But you see, even in laughter, the heart may ache. So he's having a laugh, he's at the centre of it, and he killed himself 2 days later. What do you do with that? So Solomon then goes, okay, it's not about laughter. What it is, it's about getting smashed. So you go out Friday night, Saturday night, and you get absolutely obliterated. Have a look down. You see here, verse 3. I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind still guiding me with wisdom. So he gets smashed. But I think when it says my mind still guiding me with wisdom, he says, I woke up 12 hours later with a massive hangover, and my head said, what did that do? So then he says, okay, it's not having a laugh, it's not getting drunk. I'll tell you what life's about. Sex. Have a look at verse 8. Can we see as we look down? Verse 8, halfway through the second paragraph, guys. I amassed silver and gold for myself, the treasures of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. And these were the most beautiful women of his generation. They were given, I mean, it's a terrible thing, totally misogynistic, but they were given as part of treaties. And Solomon, he finds with sex that he takes it to the end of the road with sex, but he finds the paradox of pleasure. The more you have, the less it satisfies. So he says, look, pleasure hasn't, I mean, I've been able to have whatever pleasure I've wanted. It's left me empty. So he says, I'll tell you what life's about. Life is about work. He says, you make your mark. Have a look at verse 4. Can we see, guys, verse 4? I undertook great projects. I built houses myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. So what happens is, Solomon walks in the room and everyone says, he's the man. He walks in, people stand up and go, this is the guy. I don't know, Nelson Mandela, I'm sure you've heard of him, 27 years in prison for his people. If he came in here now, I'd be standing up. Great man. Solomon walks in, people say he's the great man of our generation. And yet, and there he is, as this great man, and look what the aim of his work is. You see, so often that greatness is what people aim at. Have a look at verse 9. Can you see verse 9? I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. That was the object. He says, I've worked. I walk in the room, people say, he's the man, but still he said there's something wrong. Because have a look at verse 10. You see what he says? He says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in my work, so it was great to work. It was great. And this was the reward for my labour. Yet when I surveyed all my hands had done, what I toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. In other words, he says, what was the point of it? He says, I worked so hard. I achieved so much, and yet, what did it all mean? It was a chasing the wind. Imagine if you rise this evening, and as you came in the drive, I was running around in circles, and you said to Chris, you said, what's that fat middle-aged man doing, running in circles? And he said, it's our speaker Rico, he's just chasing the wind. And Solomon said, I was chasing the wind, because he says, I achieved this stuff. But what does it all mean eternally? And that's what I found again and again. I've worked in the West End for 25 years now. What happens is people set their goals, they achieve them, they feel euphoria, and then there's emptiness. So 2003, we win the World Cup rugby. Johnny Wilkinson has been aiming at that since he was a 12-year-old. I spoke at his school, Lord Wandsworth. The headmaster's wife said to me, all summer, all day, Wilkinson was outside as a 15-year-old kicking goals. All summer, all day. He said, and so that's what he's aimed at. He gets to 24, he wins the World Cup, and he said, I did one lap of the pitch, and I then asked myself, what's next? So the author, Jack Higgins, was asked, what do you know at 60 that you wish you'd known at 16? He said, I wished I'd known that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. It's great to achieve. So I found myself when I was at school in this system of, I'll be happy when? I'll be happy when I get through the GCSEs. It's good for 3 weeks. Now, I'll be happy when I'm in that team. It's good for 3 weeks. No, I'll be happy when I've left school. Good for 3 weeks. I'll be happy when the A-level results are out. When I'm at the right university. You'll be happy when, but there's this emptiness. And that's what Solomon found. So number one, my godfather dies. Secondly, I'm thinking, what's the point of life? The third thing that happens is, my godmother opens up my godfather's wallet. She opens it up, and she finds, after he's died, so they're on this yacht, and they've taken it back. He's died, we got his body. She opens his wallet up, and she finds that there's a list of mistress's addresses. Not just one, but a number. So she decides there's going to be no funeral. So this is my childhood hero, and I suddenly find that he's lived a double life. There's the real and there's the ideal. My godmother's so upset that she dies of cancer 2 or 3 years later. She never recovers from that, from the grief of finding that it was a double life. And time and again, that's what I was finding. That we should be one thing, and yet we're not that. There's the real and the ideal. The bloke that sums this up is Lance Armstrong. You know the cyclist, this guy? So here's his book, and it's entitled his autobiography, It's Not About the Bike. And we now know, that's right, Lance, it wasn't about the bike, was it? So he was a massive drug taker. I love the Australian lending library that when the drug scandal broke, moved this biography from biography to fiction. So they stuck it in the fiction bit. There's this gap. And when I was at school, I thought I was such a great bloke, I owed it to the world to record my life. So I'm 15 years old, and I decided I'd keep this diary. Here it is. So day after day at school, I wrote down my day. And it was an amazing experience, because I did it for you, for future generations, so you'd see what a great man I was. And I found I was a total Burke. It was amazing. So in the diary I'd write, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was world peace, but I'd never lay aside the weapons of malice and sarcasm I used in my own self-defense at school. In the diary I'd write, wouldn't it be great if the starving were fed, but I'd ask my parents for a larger allowance, and as you can see, I would eat it. In the diary I'd say, wouldn't it be great if there was sexual purity? I had a twin sister, I felt very protective of her. It's why I'm so sensitive to women. I was in the womb with a girl, and I felt protective of her, and yet that was no reflection of my behaviour at parties. And what I discovered was there's this gap between what we should be and what we are. And it wasn't just me. It was true personally, corporately, nationally, internationally. So guys, the statistic of the 20th century is this. 160 million people died violently. That's a Twin Towers a day. What is wrong with us? So, I'm 16 years old. I'm not Christian at all. But I realised from the death of my godfather, from his adultery, from my own diary, that there's a problem. What is the meaning of it all? Now, at that point in time, I have to tell you, I didn't think the Christian faith was the answer. But I started going to a voluntary communion service at my school because the girls' school, the local girls' school were around, and there was a very pretty girl called Emma Young, and she used to go. I never spoke to her. She's about 4 years older than me. But I just used to go and watch her walk up and down the aisle. I don't think she realises she's the reason I'm now a vicar. Anyway, there you have it. And I'm there one day, and the speaker at the front says by far the most significant thing said to me in 10 years at school. He says, "Who is this man who in the Sermon on the Mount said, 'Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you,' and then, as he was being judicially murdered, cries out for the people killing him, 'Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing.'" And I remember thinking, that's amazing, because I knew from my diary that I was a hypocrite. But what I then found was that as I looked at the life of Jesus in the Bible, it was amazing. I found that he started to walk off the pages of the Bible. I mean, it was amazing. And he wasn't a hypocrite. So he said, "Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you." And as he was being murdered, he still did it. And then I found he hit head on those 3 issues I was facing. First of all, death. And as I tell you this, I'm holding my best mate from university's funeral card. So what I found was this, is that Jesus lived and taught and had a band of followers. He was tried in a Roman and Jewish court. He was sentenced to die. They strung him up on a cross. They put a spear through his side. They took him off the cross. They certified him as dead. And 3 days later, he's walking around again. Now, here's the issue. If he got through death himself, he can get me through. So when I took Harry's funeral, I was crying. But at the back of the church, I said as the vicar, Jesus said, "I'm the resurrection and the life." In other words, he says, "Will you trust me with your death?" Because if he got through death himself, he can get me through. It's like there's a door marked death. One by one, we've got to go through it. 9 of my school friends have gone through it. You never know when you're going to lose them. But Jesus has come back. So my mum was dying in Basingstoke Hospital 5 years ago, and I sat with her, and I said 3 things to her. I said, "Goodbye." I said, "I love you." And the third thing I said was, "I'll see you." And that's because Christ has risen. Now, guys, can I say, if that's true that he's risen and that gets me through death, I can't tell you the significance of it. You can give me all the money in the world or the knowledge that I'll put my arms around my mother again one day, and every time I'll pick him up. So he gets through death. Secondly, what about meaning? Do you see what we've got here? What about this? Do you see these last 3 lines of the first paragraph? I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their life. What's the point of it? And as one sort of thinks about that, here's a... No, I don't know where I've left it in my bag. Hold it. Give me a moment. This is a bit of a muck-up. No. Aha. Here's another biography. This is Tolstoy, A Confession. And he says, as a young man, literally like verse 3, he says, what's the point of life? And he then says, actually, my whole life was a search for meaning. He says, as a young man, I thought it was wine, women, and song. I was a soldier in Leningrad. It was pleasurable, but it was empty. He said, I then decided the meaning of life was money. He said, I inherited my father's estate. I became one of the wealthiest men in Russia. But still, I felt empty. Then he said, I decided the meaning of life was fame. So he says, I wrote War and Peace. It's quite cool, really. He just wrote, he says, I wrote War and Peace. But despite that, I still felt empty. So he says, in 1867, I married. I had 13 kids. Open brackets. This, for a period, put me off finding the meaning of life. Can you imagine? 13 kids. But still, he said, I looked at my little boy playing, and I said, what meaning has my life that the inevitability of death won't destroy? One day he'll die. And then at the end of the book, he says, I met a peasant farmer on my farm. And he gave me this verse, Matthew 11:28, where Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. In other words, gold, achievement, euphoria, emptiness. No, Jesus says, I'll fill you. I'll fill you with meaning as you come to know me. Now with the, where's the football? Have we got one here? I saw one. I had one up here. It's gone. Did we put one there? Is there one there? Aha. Oh, perfect. With the, imagine 3 o'clock Saturday. Okay, oh gosh, there you go. That's not working. But imagine it kicking off and there's no ball. Imagine the game, 3 o'clock, there we are, Sweden, there's no ball. And people just say, well, that's ridiculous. They're going through the motions. For me, by the time I got to 17 knowing Christ, but Jesus was as central to my life as the ball was to a game. He wasn't just the rules, although I think the rules are great. He was the ball. I suddenly thought, actually, it's knowing him. And let me finish now. Let me finish it. So I found he'd risen from the dead. So holding my mate's funeral card, he gave me hope in the face of death. I found that he walked off the pages of Scripture, and I suddenly had meaning knowing him. So ever since I became a Christian in 1982, I've never doubted my meaning. And lastly, what about my diary? Let me finish with this. What do I do about this? You see, what I found was this wasn't just a diary of my life, and I was cornered by my conscience, by my guilt. But bigger than that, this was a catalogue of the way I'd offended God. So he gives us fun and food and friendship. He gives us sport. He gives us all those gifts. I love those things. But I found I was taking the gifts and ignoring the giver. And I hate it when people do that to me. I hate it when they ignore me. I hate it when they use me. Yet what I found was how I was treating God. And then I found, and this was really huge, I found that one day God would say to me, Rico Tice, did you know me? I made you. I gave you life. Did you know me? And secondly, Rico, what about the diary? What about all the times he'd slap me in the face? And then I found, and this was amazing, that Jesus didn't just rise on Easter Day. On Good Friday, he dies on the cross. So it's like, here I am. Here's my diary, all my wrongdoing. Here is Jesus dying on the cross. And it's not just the Galilean carpenter dying. He dies in my place for my wrongdoing. So it's as though he takes all my wrongdoing on himself. And he says, Rico, I'm forgiving you. And on the day of judgment, you won't pay the penalty for your wrongdoing and go to a place called hell. He says, I'll go. And I want to say, guys, judgment's great. Because judgment means how I treat you and how you treat me and how we treat the world matters to God. So there is a judgment coming. But God doesn't just make us. He loves us so much. He says, here's my son. He's going to die for your wrongdoing. Make sure you trust in what he's done. So I don't know what you make of all that, guys. But for me, by the time I was 17, I was a Christian. Why? Well, there's death, but he rises in the face of death. There's meaning. Suddenly he walks off the pages of Scripture, I know him. And there's selfishness, there's the diary, and he dies so I could be forgiven. And gradually I was like, this is massive. And if that is who he is, how have I treated him? So I don't know what you make of that, but that's the heart of why I bother with the Christian faith. I know I'm going to die. I know selfishness is real. And I think there are facts right in behind who Jesus is that mean that we can base our faith on that. So I'd love to leave you with that. In terms of taking that a bit further, a couple of things. First of all, here's a book that I've written. No one will buy it, so I have to give it away. I wrote it for rugby players. No words longer than 5 letters. They're bits to colour in. So if you want it, do take it. I'd love to give you that. But there's Letty's Church, 4 o'clock on a Sunday. What's the road again, Letty?
Foxgrove Primary School.
Foxgrove. Do people know where that is? What
Some
street?
cards by the sausages.
So head along to hear Letty preach on a Sunday. That would be a great thing. And then there are Christian camps. Ollie, where's Ollie? So tell us about the camps you've gone, Ollie. What do they entail? Summer camp?
Leamington Rushmore. And that's
Sorry, I didn't tell you I was going to interview.
No. So that's just a kind of summer camp, lots of activities, a couple of short talks every day, and just loads of fun, friends and things.
I went when I was 16, and it was great because the school was so exhausting. It was great to give the best time in the day to thinking about it. So do have a chat with Ollie if you want to get along to a summer camp. Parents can find out about it, but I thought that was a brilliant thing too. So 3 applications, Janet. Thanks very much for listening.